It's 1865 and most people think about the end of the American Civil War happening at Appomattox. Well, we came out here to North Carolina to tell the real story of the real end of the American Civil War. And it's a place that a lot of people really don't talk about anymore. Matter of fact, the National Park Service doesn't even have it listed as one of their places because it's not. It's a state historic park. North Carolina pays to keep this place. It's right here. It's the Bennett Place in Durham, North Carolina. This is where unity began. This place here is where the end of the American Civil War really happened. We'll try to do our best telling that story. Now the Hastings house doesn't look like much today. It's a pretty neat old house. It's a museum today. I can't get inside right now because it's closed, but March 25th through April 10th, General Johnston would pull back to this location, and he ends up making that house right back there his headquarters again, just like he did before the Battle of Bentonville. This entire time he's sending dispatches back and forth, and he's trying to determine what to do with his army. But eventually the choice is clear. They have to get back out on the road. And they take that army towards Raleigh and on further to Durham, and then past that. It's a tough decision for him to make. This army is wore out and tired, and it's already been beat down by the battle in Bentonville. And he's not exactly sure what to do at this point. In a couple of days, it becomes real clear what he needs to do, though. Realistically, the war's over. When he finds out Robert E. Lee has already surrendered, that's pretty much it. There's no reason for them to continue on. So, they send that letter and that information off to General Sherman, which eventually would lead to them meeting at the Bennett Place in Durham, North Carolina. But this is where it all starts. The beginning of the real end of the Civil War begins right here in this little town called Smithfield, North Carolina. It's pretty amazing. March 1865, General Johnston is holed up in a house in Smithfield, North Carolina. This house right here. And he's concentrating his forces for one big punch towards the Union Army before it becomes too large to fight. 60,000 Union soldiers are headed in this direction from the coast. It's Sherman's army. Johnston knows he has to fight, and he has to fight soon. He sends letters to Robert E. Lee, letting him know his intentions. He intends to fight. Bentonville becomes that fight. General Johnston loses that fight. And he has to fall back to a place before he ends up in Raleigh. He comes back here. So what we're essentially looking at here is the William Hastings house, which is now it's like a museum of sorts. But in March of 1865, this was the concentrated forces of the Confederacy right here. Johnston, Braxton Bragg, and all of his leaders would have a council of war inside this house determining what they were going to do, which would eventually lead to the Battle of Bentonville, North Carolina. From inside this house, he would also send dispatches to Robert E. Lee in Virginia, just before Robert E. Lee was actually forced to surrender his army at Appomattox. So General Johnston makes his way back to this location here in that house. And March 25th through April 10th, he ends up staying there while trying to decide what he's going to do with his army and the best course for it. Eventually, he knows he has to leave this area because General Sherman's concentrating 90,000 soldiers and heading in this direction. And he just lost the Battle of Bentonville. Eventually, on April 10th, his soldiers have to get up in ranks, march out of this town, and make their way towards Raleigh. It's a sad scene. A lot of the people in this area and in towns along the way make note of how sad these soldiers look without shoes, barely any clothes, and starving. Not supplied properly, not fed properly, and looking like they've lost their will to fight. The end's coming soon, and that's the trip we're going to take you on, to Bennett Place, where we talk about the end of the entire Civil War. So we're here at the town square in Smithfield, where another Civil War trail sign is, before we take off and head on over towards Clayton. And at this location on April 11th, there was fighting swirling around the area. General Sherman eventually makes his way over here and makes this courthouse, the one that used to be here, his headquarters. When he gets here, he receives the news that Robert E. Lee has actually surrendered in Appomattox. So he goes out on the steps of the courthouse and he announces the information to his men, who are all around. Eventually everyone in the area finds out that Robert E. Lee has surrendered. Bands start striking up songs, men start cheering, and some men start crying in the streets here in Smithfield. Eventually everyone knows, and the word starts to make its way to the Confederate forces as well. It is a joyous time for those Union soldiers that had fought so hard against their foe, the Confederate Army. For the Confederate Army, it's a doomed time. They see it as the end of something that they hoped could have lasted. But there's hope for the citizens here in this town too, as they're all looking towards the future together, wondering what it's going to be like. Out here on the road at these stops, you can check out a whole bunch of different places like we have been doing with these Civil War trail signs. But the little towns along the way have some pretty neat things too. Shops and places you can visit, museums, and this local area even has what they call the Ava Gardner Museum for the famed actress Ava Gardner. So when you get out here to these places, don't just stick to the signs. Go check out the towns and see what they have to offer. I'm in present-day Clayton, North Carolina, and there's a Civil War trail sign out here. It's just behind me, and it talks about the commissioners from North Carolina coming out to this location to do negotiations with General Sherman in order to spare the capital and to really negotiate a form of peace. And their train ride over here to Clayton, when it was found out that they were trying to come over here to talk to Sherman and work on negotiations, the train was actually rerouted, and they ended up being shot at through the pines because they were between skirmish lines. Eventually the train makes its way over here, and Judson Kilpatrick takes them captive and starts interrogating them. When he finds out what they were up to 4 hours later, he eventually sends them on their way, and they are able to speak with General Sherman and send Zebulon B. Vance's letter to Sherman so that he can start to negotiate peace. He eventually tells them that he would gladly do it and spare Raleigh and the capital itself and all the buildings inside of the capital city, including the college, as long as they can negotiate for the surrender of the army. He would give them his word that they would occupy the town as long as there was no resistance leading into the town. And that's exactly what happens. So now from this location, we're going to push on. We're going to head up the road and make our way towards Raleigh and see the capital city itself and the large building that's out there, along with the statues for the 3 presidents from North Carolina. I'm out at the State House here in Raleigh, North Carolina. That's what's behind me there. We're going to check out the Civil War trail sign that's directly across the street here and see exactly what it has to offer. April 12, 1865, Sherman's army moves into town, and soldiers occupy this state building here. And there's a signalman at the very top of that Capitol building up there that almost lost his life because he fell through the rotunda. When April 26 rolls around and they find out that the Confederate forces have actually fully surrendered, there is a signal that's fired from the top of that Capitol building. It was likely the last signal to be fired during the American Civil War, and it happened right here at the Capitol building in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is also the same place where the Ordinance of Secession was drafted by the North Carolinians at the beginning of the war. This is the place that was occupied immediately afterwards, and then secession was repealed October 1865 in the very same building that it was created for North Carolina. Oh, Howard and General Sherman's men camped on the grounds out here at St. Mary's School for girls. There's a curious little story that happened out here with General Sherman himself, right as he was about to leave this location in late April. As he was bidding adieu to the young ladies that were in this school, he turned around right here in this location looking up towards the school. And as he turned around, he realized that the young ladies that had just nicely greeted him off were making faces at him and shaking their fists at him in disgust. He was so taken aback by that he told that story over and over again as a curious and funny little story about his time here in Raleigh, North Carolina. No doubt the people and the citizens of this town were secessionists, that they did not like it when he rolled into town, but Sherman did make a point of saving Raleigh and not burning or destroying this town, because he gave his word to the mayor of the town that if they peacefully surrendered, they would not come under the fire. And he did what he said he was going to do. He did not destroy Raleigh. It's April 13th, 1865, here in Morrisville, in North Carolina. There's a train station that's not too far from where I'm standing right now, a couple hundred yards in that direction. There is a general that's on that train who just had his leg removed at the Battle of Bentonville. The conductor of that train has been threatened with death if he can't get that train going. The Confederates are here trying to slow down Kilpatrick and his men, who are coming up on him pretty fast. Joseph Wheeler and Wade Hampton are out here with some men in the area that I'm at right now, and they're facing in this general direction here, the road that is behind me. The Union soldiers are off in this direction over here, coming this way towards the train and trying to capture the train and the soldiers that are out here. That train gets decoupled. A portion of that train is able to make its way out to Durham, but a lot of it is not. The Confederates that are here stop Kilpatrick and their men in their tracks, but eventually they have to leave, and Hampton escapes off in the general direction that the train is going, and Wheeler heads off in this direction over here. By 3 p.m., the entire engagement's pretty much coming to a close, and then a message is sent via Kilpatrick to General Sherman from Joseph Johnston that he's requesting an armistice so that they can talk negotiations for peace so that the Army can surrender. This engagement here, which was a pretty intense engagement, was likely one of the last engagements of the American Civil War here in the East. And it was definitely a hot engagement. A lot of fire, a lot of firepower, cannons, and muskets and such. So it's a pretty neat place to be. Now from this location, we're going to push off. We're going to head down towards the Brassfield station, and we're going to see what's over there. And then from there, we're going to head down to where Sherman would have got off the train in Durham before he heads to the Bennett Place. So hang tight. This is where Brassfield Station was, and there's not really much to talk about here other than the fact that both armies had passed by this location on their way to Durham and on the way to Bennett Place. Kilpatrick had split up his portion of the army, and one portion was actually traveling this route as they were essentially hunting down the Confederates that were going through here. Today, as you can tell, this is a concrete jungle. There's nothing historic out here, and the Civil War Trails website has posted a sign out here for you to know that Brassfield Station was once here and that this used to be a place of significance. So we're downtown Durham right now, and the sign that's out here talks about the station where Sherman came in on the 17th of April 1865. And out in this location, he meets Judson Kilpatrick, and this is the first time he pretty much informs Kilpatrick of Abraham Lincoln's death. He also tells him that he is to protect the local citizens and to ensure that there are no angry outbursts by the soldiers. That's going to be a hard job to do, but he ends up having to do it. Some pretty neat and interesting information there on that sign. There's also a small map that's on there. It talks about where the last shots were fired out here and approximately where the train station is. Because remember, Sherman has to come in here on the train because he's so far away from this location that it's not going to be possible for him to ride his horse in time to meet Johnston, who has requested this meeting at the Bennett Place. Before I leave downtown Durham, I just want to pause for a second and think about this place. Today, the Durham Bulls are right over there. Major baseball stadium for minor league baseball. The tobacco factories are all lining this row here. This used to be tobacco land. This wasn't just a cliquey place for people with man buns to go hang out and have their coffee. This used to be a working man's district. But at the time of the American Civil War, there were only a couple of hundred people that lived in this area. It grew from that overnight into a massive 450,000 person metropolis. Today, it's still a pretty neat place to hang out and go check out, and people do things a little bit differently now, but yeah, it's still pretty cool. So visit Durham if you get the chance. It's real neat, and steer clear of those man buns out there. Well, after wrapping up over here, we're going to head on over to the Bennett Place. We're going to talk about the things that happened over there. And there's a 160th anniversary event that's taking place over there right now too. It's a pretty cool experience if you've never had one, an anniversary experience. Now the position that I'm at right now is what was called High Point. And there's a park out here where there's some reconstructed pieces of property and a home and a few things that you can actually visit out here and check out for yourself, as you can see behind me here. Now the position here is important for basically one real reason, which is this location was the central point or the neutral zone during the negotiation process. So soldiers would or should have been able to walk freely throughout here and not have to worry about fighting each other. although there were moments of outbursts from soldiers being shot at and things like that. And there were a lot of stragglers coming through here at the High Point area where the grist mill was, simply trying to find food. And they would come over here and essentially try to rob the place of anything that they could find to eat. And a lot of those people were basically sent away via the gunpowder and lead. Over here, Kilpatrick would have been with his men, and a lot of soldiers from the Union Army would have been stationed throughout here as well. But this was it. This was the neutral zone, the place that Sherman set up along the lines during the negotiation process for the surrender of the Confederate Army out here in North Carolina. I'm at the old Duke homestead right now, here in North Carolina, not too far from where Bennett Place is. And this place is pretty unique. First of all, there wasn't a fee to get inside, which is, it's always good to not have to pay a fee, I guess. And second of all, they have a lot of displays out here to kind of show you what a homestead life would have looked like in North Carolina, especially one that's so significant. Mr. Duke would have been out here and would have had a farm here, and at one point in time he was raising a cash crop of cotton and it failed in the 1850s. So he decides that he's going to start raising something else, which is light colored tobacco, yellow leaf tobacco. And he starts producing that crop out here in this area. Well, he ends up getting drafted into the Confederate States Navy and eventually finds himself a prisoner of war. Once he's released in New Bern, North Carolina, he actually makes his way back to his homestead, and he walks 139 miles back to his house, to this location here. When he gets here, he realizes that Johnston and his army and all the soldiers that are in the surrounding area They pretty much consumed almost everything that's on this farm, including the majority of the tobacco. But they left just enough for him to start up a brand here in the local area. He goes on to be one of the most successful producers of tobacco in North Carolina. He creates a cash crop here that would create wealth for him and many others for generations to come. walking over to Bennett Place right now so that I can check out the Civil War Trail sign that's right out front. Unfortunately, it's a little bit too early and there's no parking available. So I had to park down the street, and I decided to come back here just to check it out one more time before I head out. It's kind of a weird thing, you know, talking to yourself in a camera in front of a bunch of people. And I'm a little bit bashful when it comes to that, so I'd much rather do this when there's nobody around. On the side of that house over there, you see that chimney. There's a plaque there that talks about that being an original chimney to the old Bennett home that was here back in the 1860s. Now, the original Bennett house actually burned down to the ground in the early 1900s. And this home is an original home. It was just transplanted from another location, and it was very similar to the home that used to be here, which is why they put it in place. This is where they do all of their reenactments, when they reenact the actual surrender, and they talk about Sherman and Johnston meeting inside of a home. It happens inside this home here. Off in this direction over here, you can see that Unity Monument. I'll try to slide over a little bit. And I have better videos of this that I'll put in here so that you can see it a little bit closer, but that monument there is supposed to have two pillars, one for Confederacy, one for the Union. And there's a plaque on there that talks about the property and about the events that took place out here. And it talks about unity and uniting and all of the people essentially that are involved in this situation that happens here at the Bennett Place. The Confederate Army has been on the move in North Carolina under Johnston since Bentonville. And they had a massive defeat over there at Bentonville, which looked like it was going to be a victory on day one. But then when Sherman's army starts converging and coming together, that's when Johnston decides to take his small force and leave that place. 30,000 versus 90,000 is not exactly the number that you want to have on your side. So they decided to go ahead and push up westwardly into North Carolina, and that leads them here to the Bennett Place, and it leads them to Greensboro. That army's kind of staggered out. It's spread out over a large swath of land. Eventually they make their way to Smithfield, and they move on from Smithfield up into Raleigh, up into Greensboro, Chapel Hill, Hillsboro, and some are even in Charlotte. So this army is spread out and strung out over large pieces of land. April 17th comes around, and the Confederate leaders beforehand had already had a meeting. Jefferson Davis has actually met with Johnston and the Confederate leaders of this army over here, and he's tried to convince them essentially to start a guerrilla war. They want to make sure that these soldiers are released to continue to fight. At least that's what Jefferson Davis wants. The talk initially was to meet up with Robert E. Lee. Well, then the word comes that Robert E. Lee's actually surrendered his army, and he surrendered it for good reason. They were surrounded on all sides in Appomattox. There was no way for them to fight their way out. They knew that if they continued to fight, that army would be destroyed in piecemeal. So April 17th comes around. Jefferson Davis has already had his conversation with Johnston. He's already had his conversation with Breckinridge and all the other leaders that were out here. And then the word comes to Sherman finally that Johnston wants to talk peace. He wants to talk surrender. He comes over here and they meet at this place called Bennett Place. This home was the home to the Bennett family, and they were non-slave holding people who basically had a farm out here and trying to do the best that they could through the American Civil War. The Bennetts actually lost just about everything that they had there at the end of the war. All of their goods and supplies and all the food that they had stored up and equipment and everything was taken because of the fight that was happening. So, and they never recovered that loss. That's another sad part. What's worse is they were told that they were going to be paid for those goods. They were also told that they were going to be compensated and given a horse. When Mr. Bennett shows up to the federal camp to get all of that, he receives neither. He applies again and again with the state of North Carolina and with the federal government and is denied again and again. And finally, one of the last times that he applies for his compensation, he's told the reason why was because his son fought for the Confederate Army. And that's the way that ended for him. So April 17th, right there in that house. Now this is the old road right there that they have marked off that you can see and you can walk down. We'll do an aerial view so you can see what that looks like heading up to the house. But the old road used to pass through here, right by the Bennett Place. And Sherman would have gone down this road along with Johnston and met up here. And in the surrounding area, there would have been about 60 to 70 staff members from both sides, basically, meeting in this area. But the only thing that was happening that was important was happening inside that house right there. And there were only two real people in there, Sherman and Johnston. And that's because Sherman wanted to pull him inside and show him something. Not too long before this meeting took place, General Sherman receives word that Abraham Lincoln has been murdered. He takes the folded piece of paper out and he hands it to Johnston, who's sitting at the table. Johnston, who's ready to talk negotiations, needs everything that he can have in order to get a good deal for his army. When he reads that paper, sweat starts to pop out of his forehead, and he realizes the jig is up. The worst thing that could possibly happen has happened. A Southern sympathizer has gone to Washington, D.C. and murdered the President of the United States, which makes anybody and everybody in the South a target for criticism and a target for hate. So then he realizes he needs to have something a little bit better than just, giving up his army. He starts to talk to Sherman about possibly surrendering the entire army from Florida all the way up here to North Carolina. And that's when Sherman realizes there's a lot more to be talked about. And he tells him This is a bigger negotiation than I realized. We're going to have to come back to this. Can we agree to meet here again? And so they do. Now Sherman comes back out here and he meets with him on the 18th. And this time, Johnston has Breckenridge with him. Former vice president, a lawyer, a really big talker, and also a drinker. Sherman brings out whiskey and glasses, and he pours drinks for everybody. But at one point in time, Sherman actually gets up and gets his own drink and doesn't think about pouring anything for anyone else. Breckenridge declares that he's a hog and he doesn't like him for it. I don't think he likes him regardless because of the position that he's in. But they sit down and they talk through the negotiations, and there were documents that were presented that had some pretty good things in it for the Southern Army. By the time Sherman's done and presents what he proposes, it pretty much gives them exactly what they want. Now, the things that are in there that are contentious, that sends Grant down here to talk to them, is essentially all of the arms that they have are going to be stored within the state's armory. They are going to be allowed the rights to their property. The states are going to be allowed to continue states' government. They're going to be able to govern themselves without having anybody interfere with that. All of those things are things that were not agreed upon by the president, who is currently someone not Abraham Lincoln, and not by Grant, certainly, and not by the rest of the leaders that have the authority to make those decisions. Sherman does not have that authority. The only authority that he has is with the armies. So when the President of the United States hears that, and Stanton hears that information, it becomes a pretty big issue. There's an article written that talks about all of that, and it's published in New York. Sherman certainly didn't know about that article, or he probably would have had some crass words for Stanton. But they end up sending Grant down here to help with the negotiations, essentially to take over. They want Grant to fire Sherman and take over. Grant doesn't do that. They're longtime friends, and he understands that this situation is really hard to deal with, especially when you're a general in an army and you're not a politician. So he comes down here to assist this situation. And this is what leads to the meeting on the 26th of April. That third subsequent meeting happens because Sherman issues a general order that essentially abolishes the agreement that they agreed upon. Jefferson Davis was actually sitting down, I think, near Charlotte when he heard that the initial agreement was made, and he was happy about that. But then afterwards, when he found out it was abolished, he turned to Johnston and basically said that he should release his armies and allow them to fight on their own, and initially creating guerrilla warfare, which is not what Johnston wants. It's not what Sherman wants, and it certainly isn't what Grant wants. It would have ended in disaster for everyone. So Grant meets with Sherman. Sherman knows what has to happen. Sherman issues that order, and then he requests that Johnston meets him again. And on the 26th, they meet inside this house one more time. And Sherman essentially tells him, look, I didn't have the authority to do what I did. And this is not going to happen the way we wanted it to. The only thing that I can actually offer you now is unconditional surrender, the same way, the same exact terms that Robert E. Lee had. And of course, Johnston tells Sherman, look, my army's not surrounded on all sides like Robert E. Lee. We are not defeated by any means. Is there nothing you can do for us that's better than that? And Sherman essentially tells him no. He doesn't have the authority, but that he does have an army that can continue to fight on, and if that's the way that he wants it, then he would have to force his 90,000 soldiers towards his small force and submit them to the same treatment. Johnston, being a smart man, knows that the war is over with. He decides to capitulate, and he signs over here the largest surrender of any army, any force during the American Civil War, right here at Bennett Place. This is the place, essentially, where it really all ends. Now, there are other smaller forces that are out in Arkansas and places like that that have not surrendered yet, but they will eventually, especially once they hear about this. But any chance or any hope that Confederacy has at that time is pretty much over once this surrender takes place. Once this surrender takes place, there's no grand review. There's no stacking of the arms. There's none of that stuff. Johnston sends out his proclamation or his general order to his army, thanking them for their service and telling them that it's pretty much over. The armies that are in the field are told to go to certain places and stack their arms. And they basically start piling up weapons in these places that they've been told to pile them up in. They are relieved of duty. They are sent away, and their army surrenders in a cluster. There's stacked arms everywhere. There are soldiers that essentially just are walking off of the fields that they were in, that they were encamped in. And that's the end of it for them. One by one, these units start to leave in clumps. Groups will take off, and they'll, for example, be from South Carolina, and they will leave and start heading towards their homes. And bit by bit, these soldiers will start to kind of fade away into their homes and their farms. These soldiers that spent all this time fighting together for what they thought was a government and something that was going to continue or last, turns out it was nothing. It was over. They were going to go back to life somewhat the way it used to be, but they were going to go back to so much uncertainty that they don't really know what's coming next. They have no idea, because at this moment in time, they are pardoned by that general pardon from the officer that's in charge. That does not guarantee them pardon. That does not guarantee them that they will not have charges brought against them later on by the federal government. And Reconstruction is going to happen. There will be a version of it, but they're not sure exactly what's going to happen out here in these states at the end of the Civil War. This is going to be the beginning of a ton of uncertainty for them and their families. And it's going to be the beginning of a struggle for a whole nother group of people that have just been essentially told that they were going to receive 40 acres and a mule. And then eventually, all of that's just going to be smashed to smithereens, and they're going to be told, well, congratulations, you are now free. And that's all you get. So go figure it out. Life is going to be pretty rough for those people too. This ending that happens to the American Civil War out here at Bennett Place, there's no ceremony and there's no pomp and circumstance. And that's probably one of the reasons why this doesn't turn into a national park. But this is some pretty significant history here, and it should be protected just like all the other places. This should be a national park. you.